Welcome to the 27th Distinguished Statistician Colloquium sponsored by Pfizer, ASA, and UConn. We are grateful for our sponsors' generous support. Hi, I am Deepak Dey, UConn Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Statistics. Thank you for joining us today. I am honored to welcome you and provide an orientation for you. My colleague, Dr. Yuping Zhang, will guide us through the later portion of this program, and you will see her later. Today, we are here to celebrate the distinguished career of Dr. Mary W. Gray, Distinguished Professor of Mathematics and Statistics at American University. We'll be joined later also by Dr. Nancy Flournoy, Professor Emerita from University of Missouri, the Director, and Dr. Nawar Shara, the Director of the Department of Biostatistics and Biomedical Informatics, and Associate Professor of Medicine from Georgetown University. Before we go on, let's go over some key elements that will enhance your viewing experience. We are recording today's event, and you will be able to access 24 hours from now using the same link used to log in today. Take a look at the tabs on the platform. Program tab with our agenda, live chat, questions, polling, and resources. Let's try the chat feature right now. Type in where you are joining us from and how many of these colloquiums you have attended. I would type in stores and various other places. During the question and answer portion of our program, please submit your questions using the questions tab on the left next to the program agenda tab. We will compile your questions for our interviewers to ask during the interview portion. One lucky question asker will win a commemorative item from this colloquium, and the winner will be notified tomorrow via email. But first, let's have a little Professor Gray trivia. Shortly, you will see a poll question pop up on your screen. What was the title of Mary W. Gray's PhD dissertation? A, radical subcategories. B, a radical approach to algebra. C, power of test procedures for certain incompletely specified random and mixed models. D, objective Bayesian estimation for the number of classes in a population using Jeffreys or reference priors. Let us know what you think the answer is, and we look forward to sharing the results after the keynote address. And now we'll begin our presentation.
Hello, everyone. I'm Rick Vitale. As a recent retiree from the Department of Statistics at UConn, I'm grateful to Deepak for the opportunity to participate in this edition of the Pfizer Colloquium series. In that capacity, I have the distinct honor of introducing our speaker, Dr. Mary W. Gray. Dr. Gray holds the rank of Distinguished Professor of Mathematics and Statistics at American University. As both a statistician and a lawyer, she has dedicated herself both to education, and to ameliorating the wrongs of society. That is, to use statistics, in Mary's own words, to improve situations for people. In the 1960s, while Mary was earning her PhD at the University of Kansas, she became keenly aware that women with advanced degrees in mathematics often faced job discrimination. It was not long after that that Mary founded the Association for Women in Mathematics and served as its first president. It's now 50 years later. The AWM continues its important work, and Mary's extraordinary career has displayed a broad and creative combination of scholarship and teaching, advocacy, and leadership. She is the author of 2 books and more than 80 articles, and has given countless presentations, including to international audiences and in testimony before Congress on such topics as affirmative action, income tax reform, pay equity, and women in science. Besides the AWM, Mary has held membership and leadership status in many different organizations. To name but one more, she has been a member of Amnesty International USA for more than 25 years, including serving as its international treasurer. Over the years, Mary's work has been recognized with a variety of awards. In 1979, she was recognized with the Georgina Smith Award by the American Association of University Professors for her work on the status of women in collective bargaining. For her highly effective mentoring of young colleagues, Mary was recognized in 1994 by the American Association for the Advancement of Science with its Mentor Award for Lifetime Achievement. And in 2001, she received the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Engineering, and Mathematics Mentoring. More recently, Mary was recognized in 2017 by the ASA with the Carl E. Peace Award for Outstanding Statistical Contributions for the Betterment of Society. And now it is indeed an honor to present Mary, who will share with us her thoughts on statistics and human rights.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to tell you about some of my experience and hope that I can engage you in some of the activities that I'm going to discuss. So as we know, this is the 27th Distinguished Statistician Colloquium, and I'd like to thank its sponsors, the University of Connecticut, the American Statistical Association, and Pfizer. I like to think that statistics can open the world. In my very first job, I was asked to pour tea, not in order to carry out the well-known Fisher inspiration for experimental design, but in response to the request from the department chair that we always ask ladies to pour tea. I started out my career by saying, let's have a gentleman do it this time. It's probably not the best way to start out, but I decided later on, when I wanted to be promoted to associate professor, the department chair had removed all of my publications from my file before sending it forward. Maybe because of the not pouring tea, maybe because I also declined to make curtains for the faculty lounge, or maybe because I objected to having my phone tapped. But that may be because I was a union activist, In any case, I guess I was a troublemaker, but we got the president of the university fired and I got promoted. So this was a big improvement over being told when I first started graduate school that I shouldn't be taking the place of a man. Wasn't Kansas anymore. Kansas is where I got my degree. As Alice said, it's not Kansas anymore. My first serious human rights work resulted from my working to deliver supplies to the Central Valley farm workers, because I served on the Alameda County, California Union Council. So fortunately, my father had taught me how to drive a truck. They were short of truck drivers because the drivers of trucks don't belong to the same union. So I knew how to drive a truck instead of pouring tea. I only drank coffee in Nebraska anyway, and I learned a lot about organizing, but it was a long time before I could eat grapes again. I've often been asked whether it's different now. My students in the class just last night asked me that. Colleagues and others don't say they expect me to pour the tea. They learn better than that, but some of them probably still think it. It's certainly the case that first jobs are easier for women to get, but the glass ceiling is only cracked. It hasn't disappeared. There's still gender bias along the way. For example, in academia, the student evaluations of teaching, which administrators love, are well known to have bias. And in addition to that, of course, they rely on finding the mean of categorical variables the day after we tell students not to do that. Many jobs in academia have changed, however, even before the pandemic. Unfortunately, in the guise of trying to improve teaching, vast numbers of non-tenured positions have become available at lower pay, less security, and of course, they're more proportionately filled by women. In my own department, 50% of the tenure and tenure track people who are term faculty, in other words, non-tenured, are women, but only 27% of the tenured and tenure track are women. And actually, we're doing pretty well compared to some institutions. The idea that we separate research and teaching has become to be a strange one that I think damages both. Seems to me that researchers ought to bring their insights to teaching, and teachers ought to engage in research. In the interest of reduced teaching loads, the job of instructor has been replaced with the use of so-called instructional designers. People who don't even know how to do a t-test are now designing how we teach logistic regression. And the advisors who equally lack knowledge are telling students who come in with 2 semesters of calculus that maybe they should start in calculus 1 because it might be easier. Now, computing power, on the other hand, is on our desks or in our hands or on our watches. It's not in a massive mainframe where you had to trek across the campus, turn in your program, wait, come back, pick out the results, which turned out not to be correct, and start all over again. When I started, we used decks of cards, and if along the way across campus you happened to drop the deck of cards, a week's work was gone. One thing, however, that I do long for is the battery life of the BlackBerry. Every time Apple comes out with a new one, I keep hoping it'll have the same power. Of course, the BlackBerry was a phone. It wasn't trying to do everything else in the world. Whatever the language du jour, of course, today it's R, although Python is certainly creeping up on R. Look what happened to some other languages. COBOL, which of course was associated with a woman, Fortran, Ada, which had a feminine name, which maybe is what sunk it. Whatever the language, whatever supplies the power, whether it's a big machine or whether it's your watch, perhaps artificial intelligence and machine learning might open up new vistas. But unfortunately, they haven't opened up new vistas. They've opened up the same vistas wider. And we still have garbage in, garbage out. And I've written on the subject, a lot of people have written on the subject of all of the bias that results from making decisions on things like sentencing and parole and similar very important topics. And the same bias is there. For 4 years, the 4 years I was in Berkeley, there was plenty of activity there, although it didn't seem to me the sun ever came up until noon. There was a Black Panthers event in the streets, which was a little scary, but had a good breakfast program for the kids. The meetings looked like the one on the right. It was mainly white men, and I wanted them to look more like the one on the left, where there were all sorts of genders and all sorts of colors appearing. Also, when I got to be on the council, and then finally the vice president of the American Mathematical Society, and introduced the notion that we should have double-blind refereeing in mathematics, one of the other members of the council asked, how would we know whether a paper was any good if we didn't know who wrote it? Well, that sort of expressed what they thought about lack of bias and what they thought of the Old Boy Network. So I decided to found the Association for Women in Mathematics 50 years ago. And then later I joined up with the Caucus for Women in Statistics. Why did I switch from an emphasis of mathematics to an emphasis in statistics? And I don't want to argue about whether statistics is a subset of mathematics or the other way around, but I did decide that it took 300 years to prove Fermat's last theorem, and you still couldn't see a big impact on the world from that theorem. So it seemed to me that statistics had some potential for saving the world. But I saw an exhibit of Justice Ginsburg at the New York Historical Society just over the weekend, and I noticed the quotation of hers that I've always liked. Fight for the things that you think about, but in a way that will lead others to join you. And that's, I think, what has made the progress in women in science, women in mathematics, women in statistics as good as it is. And we've decided to join together, and we've all tried to work for the same sort of thing. But before taking on the world, I discovered that sometimes social justice begins at home. So I got an announcement about my retirement benefits, which would accrue from my work, only to learn that at retirement, a man the same age with the same accumulation of funds in his retirement account would get 15% more per month than I. To my indignant complaint to the insurance company about discrimination in employee benefits being illegal, the agent asserted that this was not discrimination on the basis of sex, but rather on the basis of longevity. So then I asked for a guarantee of longer life. So he accused me of just not understanding statistics. But I worked very hard with attorneys who were handling the case, putting together data to back up the notion that in fact what they were doing was discriminatory. Then the insurance company accused me of not understanding the law. So I fixed that one by going to law school. And we won. It takes so long, excuse me, it takes so long for things to get to the courts that by the time the case involving discrimination in employment retirement got to the Supreme Court, I could write a brief as a member of the Supreme Court bar. But I happened to be in a theater in London when the decision came in the middle of the summer, and it turned out that we had won. So the Supreme Court had taken our view that discrimination on the basis of gender and retirement plans was illegal. Now, you might not think that equality in pension benefits is a human right, but for a lot of women who had taught for years at lower pay when they had been teaching, and then at even discriminatorily lower pensions when they retired, it made a big difference. Women told us that now they could afford to have a telephone in their house. Now they could afford to eat something other than cat food. So equality in pension benefits was important to a lot of people. Some people don't even think that having a job is a human right, although it is so characterized by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In case you're wondering who's on the left, that's Eleanor Roosevelt, one of my great heroines. Universal Declaration of Human Rights deals with matters such as education, food, housing, healthcare, employment, all topics not covered by the US Bill of Rights. And I have to admit that victory for social justice that I've just described in pensions was particularly pleasant, not only because of the statistics, but because it was to my benefit as well, even though I don't anticipate retiring anytime soon. Why don't I retire, you might ask? Well, maybe I would, did I not love my job so much, although I do admit I wish I were paid as much as equally qualified men are paid. But I don't have to retire, which is another triumph for statistics. I was a member of the National Academy of Sciences Commission to make a recommendation to Congress of whether there should continue to be mandatory retirement for tenured professors. A few years previously, mandatory retirement had been abolished for most people except for airline pilots, firemen, and tenured professors. So this was to consider what should be done about those of us who were tenured. Fortunately, we backed up lots of statistics showing how beneficial people were at various ages and how unfair it would be to have mandatory retirement only for one class of people, and how that would harm education and be bad for society, and all of the good arguments that you always make to Congress, and sometimes even Congress agrees. So as a result, no mandatory retirement, and I'm still around and still fighting for rights at home. And this is a message for particularly those of you who are at expensive private universities like American University, or for any place where a lot of the jobs of your employer are outsourced out. So for example, the people who do the cleaning and the dining services at my university are not actually university employees. It's outsourced to different companies who handle this. We have pretty good employment benefits at American, in addition to a decent retirement plan, since I got it fixed. We also get free tuition. We get free tuition for our children, free tuition for our domestic partners. We get a decent healthcare plan. On the other hand, the outsourced workers don't get any of the university benefits. They now do have some health benefits through their unions, but the university hasn't done much for them. It's been a long battle, but over the last about a dozen years, I've managed to work with the union people from the unions, from the employees themselves, and some faculty members, so that we now have free tuition for the children of the workers. And we're always worried about diversity of the student body, and there's little that you can do to improve it more than looking at the children of the outsourced employees at a lot of different places. So we also need some help to prepare some of the students to be admitted, but we have got the free tuition. We haven't managed the free tuition for the workers. It was thought for some of the administrators for a while, what maybe we could give them in tuition in very low-level courses, like some low-level algebra course or some low-level writing course or something. And this was until one of the cooks said, well, you know, I'd like to sign up for a course in management because my 5 barbershops need to be expanded and I could use some management training. So that at least ended the talk about keeping the employees only in low-level classes, but we've still managed only that they can audit the courses, not that they can get credit. So as I say, if you're looking for some place to do some social justice, it may be right at your own university, or if you're in a large employer, it may be with your outsourced workers. Okay, so statistics and human rights. Statistics, I think we all know, but what do we mean by human rights? Some focus, as I've said, on the basic necessities of life, like safety and food. Others think of human rights as more amorphous. Some people think they're desirable for some people, but maybe not so desirable for everybody. I should mention, for example, that the president of one scientific society, not statistics, when asked somewhat skeptically why he had added a person to the Committee on Human Rights that I chaired, said, well, we have to have someone against human rights as well as for human rights on the committee. Well, maybe things will get better. In the United States, many of us tend to identify human rights more as civil rights, as those rights whose protection is enshrined in the Constitution. Of course, most people aren't too sure what they are. What is it that's being protected? From the First Amendment come freedom from the establishment of religion and freedom of speech, the press, and assembly. From the second, the right to keep and bear arms. Not clear whether that applies to automatic weapons and machine guns and what have you. The third through the Eighth Amendments protect those rights that we usually think of in the criminal justice context. Freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, from self-incrimination, as well as the right to a trial with an impartial jury, the right to counsel, free from cruel and unusual punishment. Now, in the protection of most of these, statistics really plays an important role. What does the Bill of Rights mean? Well, Does the First Amendment mean we can put anything we want, even the pseudoscience that we see on Facebook? Does the second mean that I can come into class with a gun in my belt to ensure appropriate attention and deference from my students, including keeping their masks on? Or, of more concern at the moment, can some student or colleague wave around a loaded gun to express her or his displeasure with the mask requirement, or with the fact that other people aren't wearing them, or with the way I'm teaching statistics? Does constitutional protection of persons, powers, papers, and effects extend to phone calls? Many view the Constitution as a bulwark of protection, no doubt, but many of us also see it currently under threat from a number of directions. Constitution isn't everything. There are additional rights which are guaranteed by other amendments beyond the Bill of Rights. In particular, the post-Civil War amendments guaranteeing certain rights. The 13th Amendment, the right not to be enslaved. The 14th, the right of equal protection. Well, equal, except not for women, not until we get the ERA adopted, which may not be in my lifetime. And the 15th and 19th, right to vote amendments, took a while longer for women to get it. That's why it's the 19th for women. We use statistics to verify the fairness in elections, to be sure that the results of elections are reported correctly, to be sure that the elections were administered fairly, and also to determine representation issues, which are really important given the results of the 2020 census. One of the projects done by my students, of which I'm especially proud, evaluated the effect of ID requirements on voter participation in Virginia. It turned out that overwhelmingly, those attempting to vote and who were turned away for lack of ID were low income and or minority voters. Now, the ID requirements were subsequently loosened, but whatever ID requirements there are, it doesn't address the issue of those potential voters who don't show up at the polls to exercise a right to vote, knowing or fearing that they're going to be turned away. So the next year after we did the exit polls to ask people if they'd been turned away, we went out into the community to try to find out how widespread the knowledge of the ID requirements were and what could be done to make it easier for some of them to be met. What you see on the right hand is a gerrymandered district. The redistricting, which is going on now in almost every state, comes up with features like this. That's one of the side effects of statistics that, like I say, for better or for worse, can be used to guarantee the accessibility or to deny the accessibility of voting to everyone. Some rights jump out as needing statistical evidence. Is the death penalty cruel and unusual? How would we know if we didn't have any statistics? What does speedy trial mean? How do we determine that a jury was impartially selected? What's the effect of bearing arms if it means keeping loaded guns in unlocked drawers when there are children in the house? Excuse me. Only recently has the CDCP employed statistics in aid of reducing gun violence. And fundamentally, with rights, what is equal in the protection of the laws? Beyond the rights conferred by the Constitution, there are those rights that Congress has legislated and promised to protect. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 deals with equal rights in employment, education, housing, and public accommodation, while Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1972 banned discrimination on the basis of sex in education. Complications in the protection of human rights arise from the court's recognition of two types of discrimination. There's disparate treatment. If you were told you just didn't get the job because they didn't want a woman, that's disparate treatment. Disparate impact means that there's some requirement that, while neutral on its face, has an adverse impact on a protected category. For example, height can be a restricted, neutral, apparently neutral requirement. And if it had been in effect, I wouldn't have had a woman pilot on my last flight into Washington. The seminal case involved a lineman in North Carolina The requirement was used of high school diplomas was used to exclude Black men. Nobody ever thought of women being blind persons. And statisticians showed that the requirement had a disparate impact on Black men in North Carolina. And it wasn't required because for years, white men had been putting up lines without high school diplomas. More relevant to some of us is a recent pay case of university faculty, where the question was whether we're basing salaries in part on outside offers, so-called retention raises, had led to an adverse impact on women and should subsequently be found illegal. This is under litigation in several cases. We don't know what the result will eventually be. Unfortunately, it's probably going to end up in the Supreme Court. A recent New York Times article told of a local installation of a major US company that gave 5 employees retention raises of $1.50 an hour without specifying on what this was based. Now, I think since the Nobel Prize that recently came out in economics, the idea of establishing higher minimum wage laws is actually economically a boon. That should be a help to everyone. The Supreme Court, way back in 1954, said that on the basis of race, separate can never be equal. Particularly, the case was in education, but applies more generally. There's a less restrictive gender discrimination standard, but gender discrimination has been found unconstitutional. In particular, the Supreme Court declared that the Virginia Military Institute's leadership courses, which were closed to women, were discriminatory because the alternative put forward by the state of Virginia was not equal even, regardless of separate not being equal. In a case where I was an expert witness, it was claimed by the city of Philadelphia that offering Italian at Girls High was equal to offering Calculus 2 at the boys only Central High. In a Title IX case, Temple University ran into trouble because the sports director testified that they had 3 women assigned to a bedroom when the women's teams traveled, and only 2 men assigned to a bedroom when men did. And when asked why, he said, well, obvious, men are bigger than women. So we did win a few. Both of those 2 cases we won. So occasionally there's some comfort. Title IX was used a lot in discrimination in college sports. Required is that the participation and support of women in athletics be substantially proportionate to their presence in the student body. The case I worked on involving Brown, the refusal of the Supreme Court to review a favorable decision for the plaintiff in the lower courts resulted in more or less ending that chain of litigation. And of course, what could be better than statistics to demonstrate substantial proportionality? Human rights now. Beyond what we often label civil rights issues here in the United States, there are broader situations envisioned by many when we speak of human rights. The deprivation of personal security, the right to live in the world. Sometimes we neglect those at home, we talk about them a lot abroad. Violence or repression by authoritarian regimes. We think of actions against individuals, like the horrendous murder of the journalist Khashoggi by the agents of Saudi Arabia, or against a class of people, such as genocides through violent killing, starvation, or displacement, or the suppression of women by the Taliban, or of minority groups elsewhere, or like Texas, where new laws deprive women of the ability to control their own bodies. Can statistics or statisticians do anything other than document the atrocities? Indeed, education and training, perhaps resettlement plans, provide the promise of better times. Certainly there's a role there for us. In particular, of course, the status of women improves as soon as women become significant wage earners. We've seen that happen in a number of countries. Here is the information developed by a group of scientific societies, university groups, and cleared with the White House Office of Science Advisors, with whom a number of organizations that I work with have been in contact. So you can look up there and see what the White House thinks that universities could be doing to help things out. They sometimes have trouble with their Zoom, however. Okay, so what can you do now? There are welcoming plans for more than 50,000 Afghani refugees, some of them documented in the reference I just gave you. Governments, state and local immigrant agencies, communities are providing food, housing, schools for the children, support for the necessities of life. But ultimately, employment is what is needed. Useful, productive employment is required. The Afghani refugees are not asylum seekers whose foreseeable future will be their returning to their homeland. There are plans under the Institute of International Education Scholar Rescue Plan to place a handful of scientists in temporary spots provided by universities, but that will accommodate very few. There are many more among the refugee population with some scientific training who could help meet the needs that currently seem to be enormous. For instance, we can always use some more data scientists. Many of the 130 communities where resettlement, where there's going to be resettlement of substantial numbers of refugees, have universities who could, as their contribution to the relief of the refugees whose fate we have brought on, we meaning the country, we could provide some training to a small number of students, free tuition, support, all kinds of things. Still, it would only be a few, but it would be more than zero. And at least it would be a contribution that many of us could make, or many of us could persuade our employers to make. Refugees are always with us. Refugees from Afghanistan and Haiti, neither region having been a stranger to widespread human rights problems in the past. Often the treatment of refugees, once they've been gathered together in refugee camps, isn't what it should be. Aside from the recent reports of what happened on the Rio Grande River, there have been reports of abuse elsewhere. I was involved for a while in the work of Help Age to study the treatment of the elderly among refugee camps in Jordan, Kurdistan, Pakistan, Panama, Uganda. But I also think of those in Turkey, Balkans, on the coast of the English Channel in France. All of these people need some help of some sort and are not treated very well once they're in refugee camps. In the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, founders of Statistics Without Borders, an organization that those of you who don't know about it should learn more about, helped plan for recovery there. But surely the planners, nor the people who were there, didn't anticipate the displacement of thousands with the next earthquake. The displacement from the first earthquake, many to South America, of course, resulted in their being ending up at the US border and then being shipped back to their homeland, where it was now a foreign locale to them. And of course, there are the abductions that are now occurring, not necessarily to refugees, but they certainly are huge human rights problems. Well, one of the things that I grew up on was demonstrating in Washington that women's rights are human rights. Education is also a human right. And much of my work in human rights has revolved around education. Relatively calm, you might think. I found this to be the case in most of the work I've done with Amnesty International, like, for example, for Roma children in the Czech Republic, or with the American Middle East Education Foundation in the Middle East and North Africa. My first dealing with an individual issue involved the release of a mathematician from prison in Uruguay. It wasn't his professional work that was the cause of his imprisonment, but rather in the past, he had been a member of parliament and chief secretary of the Communist Party. We did get him out of prison. It led me to believe that things could be done by scientists to help individual scientists. There have been statisticians who, unlike the mathematician I mentioned, have run into trouble because of the work they actually do. There's an ongoing case with the government of Greece and statistician there that we keep bringing up all the time. And in spite of a handful of trials in which the statistician has been found not guilty, he's still under threat of further action. Argentina was a case of damages that the government was trying to impose upon a woman who was reporting a cost of living that was far more than what the government was reporting. In Russia, there are ongoing problems. We're involved with the cases of several mathematicians there. My involvement in Tunisia combined work for individuals with general efforts to improve education. A Tunisian mathematician periodically arrested as a communist or a Muslim. There was a time when we the US government found a communist under every bed. This mathematician managed to, between arrests, spend some time in the United States, and he worked at the University of Maryland with my husband, who was a differential geometer. Many years later, I was warmly welcomed in Tunis as the mathematician had become the Minister of Higher Education and Research. What he recalled from his visit to Washington was that one night as I drove us around town, hoping to view the sunset from the steps of the Capitol, I got in the procession that was escorting President Reagan to the Hill for an address to Congress. Then I managed to maneuver us out safely without ending up in prison was his fondest memory of his stay in the United States. Sadly, things are once again not too good in Tunisia. Another place that I helped to visit with mathematicians was Eritrea, just as it was becoming independent. I had taken a domestic flight from Addis Ababa, but when I reached Asmara, I was denied entry for lack of Eritrean visa. Fortunately, my ex-student who had invited me could see my encounter with the border official, and even more fortunately, the official was my student's student. So he managed to let us in, and the next day, I found myself in Asmara seeing the only demonstration I've ever seen in honor of International Women's Day, with women driving tanks, unfortunately also seeing a procession of the children who were left motherless. Unfortunately, my ex-student is once again in exile from his country, and the government of Eritrea can certainly not be marked as a defender of human rights. I sometimes come to think I should stay away from educational projects abroad. Nicaragua, Myanmar, Brazil, Iraq, Palestine, all have human rights problems, not brought on by my work in education, but so do we. And there are UN agencies who are investigating the more serious cases, genocides and war crimes, and I and others have worked with them to incorporate the use of statistics in their work, but the task is immense, needs more statisticians. Not all ventures are a success. I went to Rwanda to select a sample of prisoners to begin the post-genocide judicial proceedings, but the problem was that the sample was random, and it ended up not having the people for the first set of trials in it who were preferred by the government as the initial cases, as the first people to be brought to face justice. So the sample was discarded. There was another person, however, from Rwanda clamoring to be tried. As a genocide, the perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide were subject to trial in an international court that was established for the purpose. I was contacted by an accused who wanted statistical help to show that the genocide wasn't really a genocide. It's only under the UN charter considered a genocide if the basis was race or religion or ethnicity. And this man claimed that he shouldn't be charged with murder. He shouldn't be charged with genocide. He should only be charged with murder under Rwandan law. His assertion was it was really an economic crime. Only rich people were killed because people wanted to get their assets. And it just happened to be that most of the rich people were Tutsis. I think every accused should be able to get statistical help as well as legal help and assistance, but this wasn't the case that I really wanted to consult on for a variety of reasons, primarily because my French was certainly not up to understanding the complexity of all the legal documents involved. I've also been involved in a long series of human rights connected events in Iraq. Between the Gulf War and the Iraq War, I was sort of clandestinely smuggled into the Kurdish part of Iraq to help develop a statistics program at the university in Erbil. Then I worked on a project to try to rebuild the educational structure demolished in the Iraq War. That was an interesting undertaking. Obviously, there were some schools that were destroyed as part of the US bombardment when Iraq was invaded. But contractors were hired with the intention of repairing the schools, bringing them back into shape. Problem was that the contractors couldn't find the schools that they were supposed to repair. There was no such thing as street addresses in post-war Iraq, not that there had been street street addresses in pre-war Iraq either. So what we did was conduct a survey of Iraq, finding every high school and whether or not it needed to be repaired, what its current facilities were, what its current, the extent to which it still had after the war enough teachers, enough infrastructure to keep education running. So once we had a list, then it was turned over to somebody, of course, to try to do something about it. That's one of the problems that we all find when we work on statistics and we think we get some results. It's left to somebody else to implement them, whether it's a small thing in our own way of life or whether it's an international crisis. We also worked on voting rights in Iraq, which is very difficult to judge that as a success. And finally, the last project that I worked on that didn't work was to survey Kirkuk. Kirkuk is a town in northeastern Iraq, which was a big center during the Ottoman Empire. And as a result, it had both Kurdish, indigenous Kurdish people there, and a lot of people with a Turkish background or a Turkoman background, which is not exactly the same. And under Saddam Hussein, a lot of Iraqis from other parts of Iraq were moved into Kirkuk in order to prevent its being too Kurdish or too Turkish. So the idea in the post-Iraq war period was to try to do something about an agreement as to where Kirkuk should be in the division of the various provinces around Iraq, what some of the standards should be, who should be able to take control, so to speak. The problem with that is, as you know, one of the first things you tell people when you're teaching sampling is that you need to have a lack of bias. You've got lots of non-sampling errors. And the problem was we couldn't find surveyors who could work in a part of Kirkuk that was not their own part. If the Kurdish surveyors went to the Turkish part, nobody would talk to them. In fact, they would be lucky sometimes to get away with their life. And conversely, the Turkish surveyors couldn't work in the Kurdish part. So that, again, as I say, not all projects end up the way we hope they would. And last but not least, a long-standing target for human rights work is the occupied territories of the West Bank and Gaza. Even the name of the destination is a matter of bitter contest. However, the fact remains, there's a lot that can be done. My work has been in education, in public schools, and in university. One night back in 1982, I was in London and needed to fly the next day to Tel Aviv. But on the plane, as I awoke from a nap, we appeared to be following along the path of the Nile, which is not how you normally get into Tel Aviv. Well, it turned out that there were airspace restrictions due to the invasion of Lebanon. Now, this caused me a problem because my assignment had been to try to work out some sort of cooperative arrangements for sharing the computer facilities of the West Bank universities in case of shutdowns. My resource for equipment help from IBM in Israel was unavailable as he was off to Lebanon. However, substitutes were found and at least were mildly successful. We got better new IBM equipment and the shutdowns got more frequent, but at least there was a way around them. Another time when I was working on education situations in the West Bank, I found myself at a mathematics colloquium in Ramallah, surrounded by armed Israeli forces who arrived just as we were having the usual tea and cookies before the colloquium started. We were holding a meeting, an unauthorized meeting in the local YMCA because the universities were closed. And eventually we negotiated the ability to stay for the colloquium and hear a great mathematics talk. Maybe it's dangerous work. Sometimes I thought so, but in any case, there's a lot of work remaining to be done. Be an observer or being a participant. One can decide if one wants to work in human rights, which human rights one wants to work on. There are all kinds of organizations. Some of them have a geographic base. Some of them have an ethnic orientation or a specific topic like health or housing or children Of course, not everyone makes the same choices, broader in some sense than the rights or social justice as such, but many of the principles and the techniques for study are the same. Sometimes the exercise of a right one believes in does harm to and to the perceived rights of others. There are endless possibilities. Some of the applications of statistics rights problems are as simple as a bar chart. We use the bar chart to show all of the no-named burials in Argentina during the dirty wars in Argentina. There were a lot of bodies that were buried without a name on them. And although the government asserted that the people who were missing had just taken refuge in Brazil or someplace, in fact, they were buried in the cemeteries. And you remember what Florence Nightingale managed to do with the Nightingale Rose when it comes to statistics making a change. More recently, multiple estimation techniques have proved useful in the Balkan Wars, and the challenge to Bolivian election results was based upon the application or possibly the misapplication of chain point analysis. As a lawyer, I have a pro bono obligation. I would like to see statisticians have the same pro bono obligation and provide much needed help. So I leave you with that as a way to end the notion of statistics and human rights.
Thank you, Mary. That was a riveting presentation. I'm sure we'll have many questions for you during the live Q&A portion of today's program. At this time, I invite you to head backstage by turning your video and microphone off. We look forward to seeing you again shortly. Before we head into our next segment, let's find out our first poll results. Let's see if you knew or could guess the name of Mary's dissertation title. Well done, everyone. The answer is A, radical subcategories. Now let's test your knowledge again. The polling window will open up shortly. What is the name of the mathematician for whom Mary Gray received an NSF grant to form a day in honor of for workshops and mentoring? A, Anna Pell Wheeler. B, Amy Noether. C, Sonia Kovalevskaya. Go ahead and make your choice. We will share the results of the second poll after our next segment. Next, we have some warm wishes from our generous sponsors. We will be hearing from Dr. Joseph Capillari from Pfizer and Dr. Ronald Wasserstein from the American Statistical Association. Following their messages will be a short break, and then we will resume around 4 or 5 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time with the interview portion of our program. My colleague, Dr. Yuping Zhang, will be your host for the remainder of the program. And we have already received some great questions from you. For Mary, thank you. Remember, you may submit questions at any time using the Questions tab located on the main program page. We'll compile them for the interviewers to ask during the interview portion. Now let's enjoy our sponsored videos.
Hello, my name is Joe Capillari. Behind me are all the books that I co-authored. Only joking, but I did read most of them. As a proud Pfizer employee of 25 years, an elected fellow of the American Statistical Association for the past 10 years, and a privileged adjunct faculty member at the University of Connecticut for 20 years, I am most humbled and honored to offer warmest and heartiest congratulations to Professor Mary Gray for being celebrated at the 27th Distinguished Statistician Colloquium sponsored by Pfizer, ASA, and UConn. I would like to acknowledge the generous support and commitment of my wonderful Pfizer colleagues, Denise Alamayu, Dan Meyer, and Canon Natarajan for their leadership in helping to make this glorious event a reality. Recently, I had dinner with David Salzberg, who is the first statistician hired by Pfizer, its first elected fellow of the ASA, and also the first to earn a PhD in statistics from UConn. Lots of firsts. David is the original Pfizer catalyst of this Pfizer-sponsored colloquium, and he too extends joyful congratulations to Mary Gray. As we know, Mary has been an exemplary champion for gender equity, diversity, human rights, and mentorship for all people, intended for all people, and especially those who have needed it the most, in particular, women and underrepresented populations. And Pfizer is proud to embrace that same laudable culture and commendable set of values and behaviors. One example from Pfizer is equity through parity. In 2019, Pfizer announced a commitment to increasing opportunity through parity, including fairness in promotions and horizontal movement across demographic groups. Since that time, minority representation, including women, Blacks, and Hispanics, has increased measurably throughout the organization, including at the vice president level and higher. In June of 2021, Pfizer hired Ramses Jean-Louis to become Pfizer's Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer. Mary Gray has been a de facto Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer long before this title and its significance came to the forefront. A second example is internal programs for equity. In May 2021, Pfizer launched the Breakthrough Fellowship Program and Breakthrough Research and Development, R&D, rotational program, two first-of-their-kind educational programs designed to increase Pfizer's pipeline of diverse scientific talent. A third example is equity in the community. Since 2020, Pfizer has donated more than $2 million to communities of color suffering disproportionately from the COVID-19 pandemic, and added $3 million to address specific healthcare disparities in the African American community and in social justice reform. A fourth example is equity in clinical trials. Recently, Pfizer conducted a landmark, rigorous, comprehensive analysis to the ethnic, racial, gender, and age diversity in Pfizer-sponsored U.S. clinical trials in order to establish a baseline and to evaluate Pfizer's current practices. Statisticians David Grubin, David Keller, and Canon Natarajan are among the study's co-authors. Pfizer plans to use this information to better understand the impact of our medicines across diverse groups, reduce health disparities, and ensure we are best serving the needs of all patients. This research by Radis and colleagues, an industry first, is published in the April 2021 issue of Contemporary Clinical Trials. In addition to those rich, timely examples, and with benevolent actions commensurate with Mary's altruistic aims and ideals, Pfizer and the Pfizer Foundation provide coordinated support for disaster and humanitarian relief and recovery efforts around the world. For example, Pfizer has matched donations from me and other Pfizerites to support school construction and education in Kandel, a town in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for the benefit of all students, and especially girls who have traditionally been denied equal access to education. That would make Mary Gray most proud. Pfizer has also fully matched my donations to the New England Statistical Society to support the next generation of students in statistics and data science, including scholarships and other opportunities for underrepresented minorities. In response to the recent earthquake in Haiti and to Hurricane Ida, Pfizer and the Pfizer Foundation have provided charitable grants and launched a global colleague disaster matching campaign in order to assist major organizations that provide support. In response to the recent conflict in Afghanistan, Pfizer has launched a program to hire and train 100 refugees by the end of 2022. In addition, Pfizer is committed to provide mentorship opportunities to an additional 150 refugees by the end of 2022. Finally, regarding human rights, Pfizer is proud to have been one of the early signatories to the United Nations Global Compact. The UN Global Compact, an initiative that calls on companies to align strategies and operations with universal principles on human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption, and to take actions that advance societal goals. All of what Pfizer has done and will continue to do with diversity, equity, and human rights aligns nicely with Mary Gray's lifetime passion and admirable achievements in making the world a better place for all people, especially those who have been underserved or underrepresented. Mary has personified Pfizer culture in Pfizer red, white, and blue, Pfizer values in grand style. As such, Pfizer is most delighted to salute and embrace Mary as honoree and speaker at the 27th Pfizer ASA UConn Distinguished Statistician Colloquium.
Mary, on behalf of the Board of Directors of the American Statistical Association, I congratulate you on this recognition and thank you for your wonderful address. The ASA is a longtime supporter of this colloquium, and I have been personally involved for many years. I always delight in the individuals who are selected to receive this honor, but none are more personally inspiring to me than Mary Gray. I could reel off a list of contributions that Mary has made to the ASA and to the profession, as they are numerous. She has been an outstanding teacher, leader, advocate, and mentor. However, what inspires me is that Dr. Gray has invested her time, energy, and talent into issues related to scientific freedom and human rights for many, many years. It's easy to sit back and enjoy a highly successful career in academia. It's another thing to take the unique combination of legal and statistical expertise that she has and apply it to helping those who are being oppressed and persecuted, not only around the world, but in her own backyard. Dr. Gray stands up for workers at her university who do not have the rights and privileges extended to others. I'm so fortunate to have had the opportunity to visit her campus and to have worked with her on projects, and especially to have seen how her wisdom is sought by others. Thank you, Mary, for your leadership, your inspiration, and your unflagging support for the profession, for the ASA, and especially for others whose rights are being denied them.
thank you to Pfizer and ASA for their congratulations on Mary, and also for supporting this colloquium series. Hello all, I'm Yuping Zhang, a colleague of Deepak Days from the University of Connecticut Statistics Department, and your host for the remainder of our program. Before we invite out Mary and our interviewers, let's check in with the results of our second poll. What is the name of the mathematician for whom Mary Gray received an NSF grant to form a day in honor of for workshops and mentoring? Good job, everyone. The correct answer is C, Soya Kovalevskaya. Remember, one lucky question asker will win a commemorative promotional item from this colloquium. We will randomly select the lucky winner from those that pose their questions using the questions tab. Now I will step backstage to continue to monitor the questions. I invite Mary and our interviewing team of Drs. Nancy Flournoy and Noah Shara to join us.
Hi, thanks, Mary. That was wonderful. It's always moving not only to hear about all your personal trials and travels and things that you're involved in, but also to get the perspective that you give when you kind of lay out the timeline of how laws are passed and this and that happens. It's always quite awesome. So we have some questions. Let me ask you first. I recall that there was some great female talent, mathematical talent around Berkeley at the time you were there. Tell us a little bit about that time and what it meant to have female colleagues.
Well, actually, I didn't have female colleagues. At the time that I was at Berkeley, there were no women tenured mathematicians, tenure-line mathematicians. The only tenured person that I knew was a statistician, and I worked with her and later was able to publish some material on salary equity with her. But the people who were at Berkeley were Julia Robinson, who was the first woman mathematician elected as a member of the National Academy for work on one of Hilbert's problems. When it was announced that she was elected to the National Academy, and the San Francisco Chronicle called up the university and said, "We can't find her name in the faculty directory. Who's Julia Robinson?" The person in charge of programs at the University of California said, "Oh yeah, that's Professor Robinson's wife." And then there was also the wife of a statistician who was fairly well known and who taught occasionally, and another mathematician who was the wife of a mathematician and taught occasionally. And I got to teach in the summer because my husband was on the faculty and I couldn't teach during the regular year. So I taught at a nearby university. So there were people around, but there were in no sense were they my colleagues. A few years later, women started coming as graduate students, which is always a good first step. And before I left the Bay Area, there was a huge controversy about hiring a woman in the tenure track position. One of the controversies being that she was a woman, and second, she wasn't American, and people were upset about both of them, I think, equally. So Berkeley was a good place to be, and there was lots of good mathematics going on there, and lots of women who came along a little bit later. But at the time I was there, it was sort of a lonely place.
Yes, well, Noir?
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you today, Dr. Gray. You've been a lifelong mentor, not just in academia, but also a life mentor to me. And I appreciate this honor of having the ability to ask you questions. So you've excelled in a field that was dominated by men. Would you share some decisions you made that helped you along the way?
Well, one of the things that I started out thinking was, don't get mad, just get even. So you spend your time thinking about how you're going to get even. And usually it's by trying to do something good, either for yourself or for somebody else. No point in wasting your energy getting mad. The people, first of all, it's not clear they're ever going to change. And secondly, who cares? There's other stuff you can do.
Thank you.
So I would like to congratulate you on receiving a major award from the Mathematical Association of America last July. This was for contributions to the field of mathematics and to the association. And I heard that you'd been nominated for this award decades ago, back in 1983, but that the society leadership, nominated by the awards committee, and the society leadership refused to give you the, actually give you the award. And so none was awarded at all in 1984. And you just, I guess, learned about that this last year. So you must have mixed feelings about what they say is turning, I saw in the newspaper clip, they called it rectifying this omission. So can you tell us how you think this change of heart reflects the change in times, or?
Well, I think a lot of credit to the executive director who, in cleaning out the basement, discovered that this was the year in which the award was not given and asked the question, why was no award given? And found out about the recommendation, which was then turned down. It's sort of, the reverse of pulling down the statues of Robert E. Lee or taking Fisher's name off of awards or so on. They were trying to show that people who make awards have had a change of heart. I, though, have never been told exactly who objected strongly and exactly why. It could have been simply because I was a woman and they didn't believe in women mathematicians. It could be because I'd started the Association for Women in Math and they considered it a rival. It's sort of like two unions fighting one another. Not a very pleasant thought, but it happens. I had done a lot of work on involving minorities and had a few grants from a few foundations to work on issues with HBCUs and so on. It may be that they were envious of that, although you think they would have been supportive. It may have been because I did a lot of work with Palestinians at the time, and that was one of the periods when that was not very popular, never that it ever is. Or maybe that what my late husband would have said, I was just too pushy. And I'm still just too pushy, but they decided they would give me the award anyway.
We're glad you are pushy.
All right. I'd like to, you've told us about the turning point in your life when you decided it was time to get a law degree and you did so. I just have to say, I'm glad you were not challenged further, that you didn't understand something else and yet another field and you pursued yet another degree, given how tenacious and how pushy you are, as your late husband has said. My question to you, Dr. Gray, throughout your career, do you find it easier or more impactful to get messages and ideas through using the language of law or the language of numbers, or both? And if you can give an example.
Well, it's difficult because you run into too many lawyers who say, the reason I'm a lawyer is because I never liked mathematics. And it gets pretty hopeless. But then sometimes students can get pretty hopeless. In a course I taught last spring, I had a retired law professor who was taking this graduate course in statistics because she never understood what the people were talking about. And now suddenly, since she was retired, she was deciding to learn the statistics. So it's, C.P. Snow thought there were two cultures. He didn't think one was mathematics and one was the law, but it might as well have been. It's difficult sometimes, and people speak different languages. I even feel myself putting on and taking off my law hat, my statistics hat, depending on with whom I'm speaking. Lots of times I just assume people didn't know I was a lawyer because they want some free legal advice. And then occasionally they want free statistical advice. So there are some people who appreciate the fact that statistics is important. Generally, people will tell you, if you push them into a corner, there are too many lawyers and not enough statisticians. And that's a very comforting thought.
So Turning to social justice, with regard to an individual person's work to work in advancing social justice, how might you weigh working with an organization versus doing statistical work with an organization versus taking a legal route? I didn't put that. If an individual is trying to decide where to put their effort in a particular case, you know, you have a cause. When do you decide to try and change the organization, and when do you go to the law?
I think sometimes laws is going to be the last resort. It depends upon how, in some sense, in how serious the problems are. As I've said, I've always felt pay equity was an issue, but it wasn't an issue that my life depended upon. I always had enough to eat, roof over my head, etc. So you do things to try to support organizations and make things work because you can get along with some not so good things at the same time. And that's a judgment you have to make. I tell people, don't resort to the law unless you really have tried everything else, because that's often doesn't lead much of any place, and there's nothing left after you've lost. Whereas if you were working with an organization, the organization is probably still there, and if it isn't, you can go start another one. I recently stopped being chair of the board of an organization because I couldn't put up with some of their policies. I still work with the organization, but I can't stand the identification with some of the policies. So it's a balance. It always is.
All right. So Dr. Gray, innovative technologies, including artificial intelligence and machine learning, have been championed as crucial for solving humankind problems such as poverty and for ensuring health and well-being across the globe. How are such achievements jeopardized, knowing the famous expression that you've used in your presentation, garbage in, garbage out?
No, I didn't hear the last sentence.
Can you repeat the question, or the last piece of it? How are such achievements jeopardized, knowing the famous expression, garbage in, garbage out, in using AI and machine learning as, you know, the humankind solution to solve poverty and other health and well-being issues?
Well, the problem with garbage in, garbage out is there's lots of garbage in the world. And it's very difficult to distinguish it sometimes from what the facts of the matter actually are. It's a day-by-day sort of thing. You have to put everything on that you can find on the table and turn it over a couple of times before you go any further. You can't always make decisions easily. Now, can you introduce new methods? Yeah, you can introduce new methods, but one of the things you have to ask yourself down the road is what's the end result of this? There are people who won't get involved in any kind of military work. There are people who won't get involved in any military work that involves killing people. Well, it's very difficult to see how you can be in military work not involved in killing people. You can work for an organization that generally does good things, but occasionally does something really bad. And it doesn't make up for the fact that they do really good.
Definitely.
I can go to the next question.
Yes.
So fake news and misinformation cause chaos and noise. And judgment is difficult because the world is such a complex place. How do you manage?
You're splitting out again. Can you put it, or can somebody put it in chat so I can read it?
Oh, I'm gonna get a microphone better. Bill?
No.
I got it here.
It's not a question of being close to something. It's a question of it's being garbled.
I see. Okay. Nancy, you wanna?
I got it.
Yeah.
You want me to read it? I'll read it while
Yeah,
you're
no,
reading.
I can read it.
Well, I mean, you need to read it out loud for everybody.
Yes. Okay, well then you need to flip it back up.
Did you get it, Mary?
Yep. Fake news and misinformation cause chaos and noise. Judgment is difficult because the world is. Am I to finish the sentence or is there more to it?
Judgment is difficult because the world is a complex place. How do you manage to make sound judgment in a world full of noise, especially when you're dealing with human rights issues?
I think you need to assume that people are acting in the best interest of someone. Now, the question is the someone themselves or is the someone a broader collection of people? And then on that basis, decide which it is that you want to put your money in or your time in. The noise that comes across, actually, the noise that comes across is one of the least of the problems because the louder people shout, the less likely it is they have anything to say. That's always been my judgment of politics, but it also is my judgment of a lot of other fields. If you have to be shouting, it's probably because you don't have anything to say. So you can weed out some of that in the first place, and then see what you can dig behind what's being said. Now, considering recent developments to political and human rights front, such as Afghanistan, then what comes after that?
Was that a question?
No, I was reading off the chat, but it stopped with that. And the problem with chat is it never gives you all of it.
Okay, well, I'm going to go with the next question. So you've been active in both statistics and the mathematics communities. Can you tell us a bit how those cultures compare over time with respect to equity issues?
Well, it's interesting. I used to make the judgment on the basis of the leadership of the two organizations. The ASA has had a number of women presidents over a period of time. I've often thought that they only let the terms last a year so they can work more people in. I don't see how it's possible to be an effective president of an organization as complex as ASA in a year, but women managed to do it. So from the point of view of enhancing the leadership of women, I think the Statistics Association, that ASA has been ahead of the Mass Society. The Mass Society in its first 100 years had exactly 2 women as president, and that was in the last maybe 10 of the 100 years. And that term lasted longer. I don't think that had anything to do with it. I feel that there used to be a saying in Europe that in England, professors think they're God. In Germany, they are God. And that statement came out of the community as I know it in mathematics and not statistics. The problem with mathematics in some sense is that my screen went blank, but I can talk anyway. Mathematics is too much in academia. There aren't enough people in math society who come from government or who come from industry. There's another mathematics organization called the Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, which has more non-academics in it, and it's less elitist. But mathematicians are very elitist. The very top structure in mathematics, at any time, maybe the top 5 mathematicians in the world tend to be great people. They're modest about their own work. They're encouraging of other people. They behave in a way that's really admirable for someone to be a model to younger people. But then it's the next 50 who tend to be obnoxious. And that's the people that you deal with mostly on a day-to-day. I was mentioning being at the mathematics colloquium in Ramallah surrounded by the armed guards. That happened to be because Israel was giving a prize to a very well-known mathematician at the time, who'd won all sorts of prizes, but it was someone I knew rather well. And I had been asked to manage to get him to Ramallah because it was a problem. But in any case, he was perfectly willing, not perfectly willing, he wouldn't take the prize from the state of Israel unless he was allowed to speak in the West Bank. So that's the reason we had to arrange this. So as I say, sometimes the people at the top are the best. It's the next layer. It's the people whose own aspirations haven't been met, and they take it out on other people. And I found it more in mathematics than in statistics, but I didn't know statisticians well for the first 10, 15 years of my career. So I can't really make a judgment that way. And mathematics, as far as getting women as president, has done very well in the last half dozen years. And the Association for Women in Math has been much more interested in social justice causes than has the Caucus for Women in Statistics. Not to say anything against the Caucus for Women in Statistics, because it emphasizes something else. So I think the women's organizations in both cases have been quite similar, except that AWM got started earlier in schools. Now the caucus is working a little bit in school programs, but not nearly as much. The Association for Women in Math has been better at getting outside funding, which of course is an important aspect if you're trying to do social justice, because it costs money and most of the people who are working in it don't have much.
Well, thanks, because asking about the societies there was my next question. So Noir?
Yeah, is it better now, Mary? Can you hear me
Yes.
now?
Yes.
Okay, great. You considering recent developments in the political and human rights fronts, such as Afghans coming to the US, the prosecution of minorities in some countries, and the mistreatment of women in workplaces and discrimination against scientists in some autocratic countries, how do you think you and others were able to help using data and statistics?
Well, it's a little bit at a time. You know, with respect to the Afghanistani refugees, there were 60,000 of them. So I don't expect I'm going to be able to do anything for a large number, nor is my university. But on the other hand, there are 3,000 universities in the United States. If each one of them decided to give a training position to an Afghanistani refugee to train them to be something in a professional field in which there's a great need, like data science these days, the average size of the family among the refugees is between 5 and 6. So if you could manage to get 3 people trained, manage to get 3,000 people trained, you would have a real inroads into the 60,000. There's then the training of people to do non-academic things, which is, like I said, my father taught me how to drive a truck. That was really useful in doing human rights work, but that's not why he taught me to drive a truck. You need to think about getting people in positions where they can get employment that's going to last. Uber drivers are terrific, but it's not a career.
Thank you. I think we can go over 2 of the questions that came from the audience that fall under social justice. Nancy, should I go over the first one?
Sure.
This first question came from David Grubin at Pfizer. There is a movement among social justice advocates in academia, college and high school, that math is racist. When you encounter a person making that statement, what do you say to that person, and what should the ASA's position be?
Well, that's a very timely question, because we have people at my university who want to get rid of a placement exam we use to put people in the first math or stat course they take at the university. And you look at the statistics, and it's true that the average score on the placement exam of minority students is less than the average score of non-minority students. But instead of investing the time and the energy and the money in more training programs so that the minority students are better trained, and if they take a placement exam would score better, they concentrate on just putting people in any old course where they're not likely to succeed very well. I attribute it at universities. In businesses, I don't have that much experience. In universities, one of the problems is most courses don't have prerequisites. I've discovered that in my years in the university. There are people who are taking junior and senior. Well, if it's a language, yeah, you don't take advanced French if you don't know French. But for the most part, I looked through just a week ago whether or not a number of the courses in a number of departments had prerequisites, and they don't. So you're not expecting any preparation on the part of a student before you put them in the course, no prerequisites. That's not true in math. Math courses always have prerequisites. They're not necessarily stated, and they may be high school training rather than college training, but math is linear. And the concept of needing prerequisites and having linear progression is not understandable to people who don't do it themselves. And it doesn't matter how many times you try to explain this to them. It doesn't seem to do a lot of good. One of the things is when we hear this from a dean, we ask the dean to take the placement exam himself or herself. And then they decide that maybe there is stuff that they don't know, and maybe they need to go back and pick up something that they didn't learn in 11th grade arithmetic or whatever. I don't know what the problem is long term. Yeah, it is racist. So are, for example, driving licenses. It's true that the pass rate for a driver's license in the state of Maryland, and I presume probably most states, the pass rate for minorities is less than that for non-minorities. But most of the kids who take a driving test in Maryland, I shouldn't say most, a large number go through driving programs in high schools where they offer the programs, whereas a lot of the minority students don't stick around high school long enough to take those courses, don't have other opportunities to learn. So they might not have some of the skills of learning to be a driver that you would like them to have. I certainly don't want anybody to become a medical professional who hasn't acquired some basic skills. So I think you see the problem more in colleges and universities, anyplace else. And again, I attribute it to people lacking the understanding that math is linear. You have to do on step one to get to step two.
Great insights. Thank you, Dr. Gray. We have another question that falls under this category as well from Garrett Frady. It seems to me that a major issue, aside from the obvious fact that some people simply do not acknowledge equal human rights for all, is the lack of awareness regarding the impact certain policies have on different groups of people. I believe statistics and all sciences in general could play a big role in portraying the devastating impacts of policies that intrinsically deprive different groups. The lack of awareness seems to be a result of people not trusting science or not believing in science, which seems to occur because of that controversial intersection of politics and science. How can we avoid politics overshadowing sciences so that sciences are used to help politics rather than a point of argument?
Well, it's a long-term sort of thing. From time to time, we get an announcement in government that we're going to have evidence-based policies. The evidence-based policies are not always based upon evidence. There are people working in the statistical field who are not interested in equity. I don't want to bring up Fisher again because there are a lot of people who have similar points of view. They're a great deal more quiet about it than he was. But in almost every case, if you have a policy, you can see that it might have an adverse impact. Certainly the case of the Virginia ID laws, the requirement that you have an ID that consists of a driver's license or a birth certificate or a passport. Well, immediately you can see, it takes no great knowledge of statistics to see that that's going to have an impact. And you go out and gather the data and it shows, yeah, it has an impact. And does it matter whether you can drive or not if you're going to vote for your local representative? If your birth certificate was issued so long ago that birth certificates weren't common, should that keep you from voting? So that's the announcement of that policy. The issue of the minimum wage, the recent work from the Nobel Prize winner in minimum wage is going to be very helpful because you always hear, you don't always hear, but you frequently hear people claim that raising the minimum wage is going to have an adverse impact on wages in general. Well, it turns out not to be true if you do any kind of comparative study. So it's up, anytime anybody comes up with an idea, it's good to try to find out what in fact is the effect going to be down the road. We look at various sorts of things. I have students doing a project now, which has to do with what makes a park space useful in a community? Is it the amount of green space? Is it whether it has a basketball hoop for the kids? Is it whether it has picnic tables for the adults? What makes it judged more successful by the community? Well, it turns out that it's probably going to be the distance to a metro stop. But you're not going to know that unless you do some statistics. And the project's not done yet, but at least that's a hypothesis that they have. And they thought it up from some stuff they had read about what they knew about the parks in DC. So it's a policy that you can at least have some test. That doesn't necessarily prove it, but it at least has some test. The fact that the metro doesn't run in DC, which those of you who know DC will know, half of it is out at the moment. That has a heavy impact on the minority community, but it has an impact everybody. Why don't we fix the metro? So what are we going to do?
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, you need more statisticians, look around. I don't know how other people teach advanced statistics to undergraduates or statistics to graduate students, but I always give them projects and ask them to go out and look and see what policy there is around and what impact it might have on different kinds of people, what possibilities are for improvement, what would it cost to make things better. And they're little projects. They're usually either the community of Washington and Northern Virginia, or they're back home where the students came from, but encouraging the students to get used to looking at stuff that has an impact on social justice. A lot of them will continue to do so. I mean, I admit a lot of them won't, but at least it's a start.
So while you're giving advice, what do you have to say to the lone female or other minority person in an organization or organizational group, like the lone statistician or the lone female statistician, the lone minority statistician?
Yeah, hang in there. You need to look for outreach. You need to go to meetings. Okay, pandemic's been around for the last year and a half, but we all hope it's going to get better. And you can't make friends very well in that kind of isolated position if you're relying on Zoom. But on the other hand, if you go to a meeting, if it's a broad enough meeting, it's bound to have somebody else that's in a similar situation. And if it isn't, you just need to go up to the group who's standing and talking there and insert yourself into the group. Listen for a while, see what they're talking about, and see if you can manage to join the conversation. Sometimes you'll be able to, sometimes you won't. But you have to make the effort, and it's a lot of effort just to get associated. That's one reason why so many women mathematicians do applied math, is because they've sought refuge in other departments. People to talk to, and they found somebody in some other field and they can work with them. Same thing is true in statistics. You see a lot of women working in applied fields where they have built bridges to people in other kinds of disciplines because they are the lone statistician, but they're not the lone person who's interested in statistics, and they're not the lone person who's interested in social justice if they want to do something to make things better.
That's a great building bridges. I like that. Yep. So if we don't have any more questions, this will be the last question. And I wanted to ask you about the advice that you could give to statisticians from being, from caring to doing. What can get them doing? We know they care, but how do we get them to do things?
Well, the next time they find something annoying, they should ask what's behind that, and is there anything I could possibly do to fix it? As I say, if you're in any large organization where you outsource some of the employees, that's a good place to start. There may be problems that they're having and they don't have any voice in the organization as a whole, and it's someplace where you can step in. You need to, find a little crack and then force it open. It doesn't always work as well as you'd like it to, but at least it's a place to start.
I see we have another comment in the chat, which says it's a comment, not a question. So let me read it. This is from Mark Bernison, Professor Emeritus at Baruch College, CUNY. and Professor Emeritus from Montclair State University. And he recalls meeting you around 1990 when I served on an ASA committee on scientific freedom and human rights, chaired by my late friend UConn's Herb.
Herbstein, yes, of course.
I recall
well
an
remember Herb.
yeah. I recall an inaugural meeting with Ms. J. Rohn of Human Rights Watch with the intention of helping establish statistical support for redeveloping a population listing, quote unquote, using capture-recapture methods of those killed in the then alleged genocide perpetuated by Saddam Hussein in the Anfal against Kurdish populations. Hearing your talk today outlining your numerous accomplishments on the behalf of humanity confirms my long-held belief that statisticians have the opportunity to do much to help make this world a better place through promotion of human rights and social justice. I wish to say thank you for all you have done and continue to say. And I think we all add our agreement.
Thank you very much.
Great.
Herb was an inspiration to us all.
So I think we go backstage. I think that's it. Oh, Yo Ping's coming back. No, I think we're finished.
I think Yuping will close this session. We'll just wait for a little bit.
Oh, there she is.
Thank you. Thank you to our interviewers and the audience for the thoughtful questions. I would like to now recognize the organizing committee, my colleagues, Deepak Day, Han Bar, Yao Zheng, administrative staff, Tracy Berg, Courtney Trisco, and Juliet Capacis for their dedication in seeing this colloquium come to fruition. Also, thanks to our dedicated steering committee members, Kanan Natarajan, Demisi Elmihayo, Dan Meyer, Ron Wasserstein, Nancy Flournoy, Deepak Day, Joseph Glass, and Minghui Chen. Mary, on behalf of our sponsors and our guests, we would like to thank you for such inspirational remarks. To honor your participation in this event, we have presented you with a plaque in recognition of your exceptional contributions to our field. Mary, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, I would. I have a nice plaque here, which I'm holding in front of the camera. I thank the sponsors, Pfizer, ASA, and University of Connecticut for it, as well as for inviting me. It's always a great opportunity to have a platform where you can express your views. I hope that a lot of people will be inspired to do some things for human rights and social justice. It was a good experience for me. It was great to be back with Nancy, who was extremely helpful to me along the way. And it's always good. Noir has been a substantial support in more recent years. So it was a good production. You people at the University of Connecticut are great. Unfortunately, we have to do everything virtually, but the next time I pass through Connecticut, perhaps I can say hello.
Thank you, Mary. As a reminder, the recording of today's program will be available in approximately 24 hours. We will send you an email with viewing instructions. Thank you once again to our sponsors, Pfizer, ASA, and UConn, for making this event possible. Thank you all for attending. Hope to see you next time, and be well.